technologies like blockchain, digital currency, decentralized finance are reshaping the monetary landscape. But what is the next big thing, the next frontier? To answer that, we brought diverse experiences of people along with Corbin Fraser from Bitcoin.com, Puja Ohlhaver, and Glen Weyl from Microsoft Research, and finally Kenny from Manta Network, representing to you the future of money. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you. So I'll hang it over in front of me. Yeah. Well, welcome everyone. So this is the fireside chat, talking about the future of money. I'm honored to be here. My name is Corbin Fraser, I'm the moderator of this panel, where we'll be diving deep into the exciting world of crypto and where the future of money goes. We've got some experts here, including academics, researchers, as well as developers behind some of the finest and funnest tech in crypto. So I'd like to introduce you guys to Puja, Glen, as well as Kenny. Maybe quickly before we dive right in, do you guys want to quickly introduce yourselves? Briefly, background on your experience here, and yeah, where you guys are from.
Sure. I'll start. I'm Puja. I currently live in Switzerland, and my background, I'm a lawyer by training. I am also a technologist in the plurality tradition, and I have a background in public policy, law, finance, and medical device entrepreneurship, as well as thinking about consensus protocols and more recently decentralized identity.
Great. I'm Glen Weyl. I'm a former economist. I was a professor at the University of Chicago, and I am now usually at Microsoft, but I'm on leave this summer because I wrote a book with Audrey Tong, who you'll see on those posters. She's former digital minister of Taiwan, and we've been traveling around the world telling the story of plurality, which is a vision for the future of technology and how it can facilitate cooperation across very different people.
I'm Kenny. I'm obviously sitting up here with giants, and I myself have been an entrepreneur just in technology for quite a while. I started my first company more so in the cloud computing space, and the intersection of technology and finance has always been something that's very curious for me. And I was actually, I studied a lot of this while I was doing my master's at MIT. And I had the opportunity to also be the teaching assistant for current SEC chairman Gary Gensler. And that's where I really focused and honed in on this concept of cryptocurrency. And afterwards, met my co-founder while studying, and we went knees deep into building on Web3. And so we started Manta Network.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining. We are maybe going to kick things off by just going through a brief synopsis, I think, of some of the exciting things that are going on in this space. So to date, we have Bitcoin, which some are calling digital gold. Some say it should be used as money. Others, it's a new speculative asset. We've got Ethereum and countless other layer 2s. We've got new developments in crypto. We've got some of the exciting research and things that are actually being built around some of the papers that folks like Puja and Glen have contributed to. Specifically, I'm speaking to soulbound tokens and things like that. Could you guys maybe cover off what do you feel like in the future of money, what's still missing?
Can I give just one other thing that's going on right now that I think is maybe more important than all the things that you mentioned, but that people around here don't know about too much, which is these new payment infrastructures in the developing world, in particular the Unified Payments Interface in India, the PIX system in Brazil, the Pay Now system in the US, the Fast Pay system in Singapore. These, if you talk about what are the headline goals that people usually discuss in the crypto world,
Mm-hmm.
I would contend that probably about 10x more progress has been made by those systems towards addressing those goals than by the entirety of the Web3 crypto space put together.
That's a
So I
great
just think
take.
it's really important to keep that in mind because we're
Yeah.
kind of almost completely missing most of what's actually happening if we don't talk about those.
I think that's a completely fair observation as well. Like what we see here at these crypto conferences, we often are viewing the world from a very narrow lens. And I think, yeah, we would be remiss if we didn't mention some of the exciting things that are happening globally across some of the traditional financial payment rails that are making it easier for banked and unbanked people to use money in a positive manner. So I think you're absolutely right. Where I'd be curious is why? Why are those traditional financial payment solutions being innovated faster or better than what we're currently seeing here in some of the crypto space? Is it due to the speculative nature? Is it due to the difficulty of dealing with self-custody and smart contracts? Where do you guys see this space kind of needing more help to compete?
Sure. Well, I think it's all of the above. So I think a stable coin policy that is sensible will introduce more trust right into the system and a sensible regulatory framework. There's still a lot of skepticism and distrust, and of course, because of the projects that do launch on crypto that in the for example, the most recent spate of meme coins, right? That is actually pure wealth transfers, right? Not actually generating real wealth. These payment rails have not been really widely adopted, although at the same time, in a lot of countries that don't have solid central banking, or where if you're fleeing a country, cryptos, like I know plenty of people who have fled autocratic regimes and relied on these payment rails and didn't have options, right? So I still think we are very early, and hopefully we can get into in this conversation about really unlocking the potential. I still, if you sort of take financial history, and if you draw the analogy of like Bitcoin and gold, right? Like the financial system and the wealth creation that we've experienced in like the 20th century, that was not built off of gold as a reserve currency, right? And so those more profound credit transformation is something that still like hasn't happened, and we can talk about that, but I still think we're very early.
Yeah. Kenny, maybe you could weigh in a little bit from where you see things from the entrepreneurial aspect. Do you see these as opportunities, or are these just flaws with the current dynamics in cryptocurrency?
It's a really good question. So I think, just to think about kind of the pace of innovation, right? These solutions that Glenn had mentioned versus, everything that we've been building for in the crypto space. I think there's two focuses here that kind of create frictions, I believe. One is the on-off ramps, and the other one is focus. The on-off ramp specifically is, regardless of how much you want to believe, and I'm sure everyone in this room wants to believe that, the future of payments is decentralized at the current moment, right? Like there's no way you're going to be walking into a Starbucks and saying, hey, let me just pay in Ethereum or even USDT, right? It's just not practical. And so it really limits the use case. And when that use case is limited, then there's not really any incentive as much to innovate. And so I think what we've seen as a result is you've created this insular ecosystem where we say, okay, let's just build things in Web3, right? But this intersection of Web3 and Web2, this real world, these financial payments, I think the current catalyst isn't there. And so I think that's one of the frictions. The other one is more so focus. And I think anyone in this space that is a builder can see this trend happening, which is, one day you're the hottest project on the block, and then next day everyone's thinking about AI, and then ZK, and then GameFi and SocialFi. And if you try to keep up with all these trends, you realize quickly that you're going in a loop to nowhere. And so I think that decentralized aspect, while it creates this environment where there's a lot of freedom to decide on what sort of initiatives you want to partake in, it also creates sort of a slower pace of innovation because not everyone is focused on the same sort of goals as you would see in any particular industry, right? Like if you're talking about healthcare, what are people focused on? They're focused on healthcare, right? When you're talking about finance, people are focused on finance, oil and gas, right? But when you say crypto, what are people focused on? They're focused on AI, they're focused on games, they're focused on social, they're focused on payments, et cetera, right? It's like creating a whole different sort of, lack of a better term, metaversal world. So yeah, I mean, I think those are sort of the current considerations for one of the discrepancies between, you know, the more centralized approach to innovation and a more decentralized approach to innovation.
I also think, picking up on what Kenny said, if you think about the last real revolution in how payments occur, which was credit cards, the order of innovation was almost completely opposite to the current process. And also, in these successful things that I was talking about, it also was completely opposite. So what do I mean by that? Crypto world started with money. That's really sexy. I like money. I want to hold a bunch of money. I want to carry it around. That's like awesome, you know? And then it said, okay, and then how do I build on top of that other applications? And then how do I get people to use those applications? But you think about what happened with credit cards, precisely the opposite. The first thing that they said is, how do I get acceptance? You know, before there was anything about credit, before there was anything about money, it was just like, physically, how does this thing even work? It's like, I'm gonna have this physical card, and then they like figured out the absolute minimum functionality for that thing. Like, what can I do to have a physical card that is used for something? And that's how you got like these diners cards and whatever. There was no like abstraction about money, whatever. There's just like, can I get a physical thing that people can use to do something?
Yeah.
And then they said, okay, and then how do I get credit built on top of that? And so that's how the credit card came in. And only last did they figure out, how do we network those things together and have them be something like money? So it's like the order of operations was completely opposite, because the focus was on like utility as quickly as possible to real people, and abstraction being built on top of that utility. You know what I mean?
I think it's important to note too that like the foundations of the credit card, there was in some aspects a airdrop that did occur with the early days of credit cards. They had this very difficult problem of multi-sided markets. You need merchants who accept the credit cards, and you need people who hold credit cards and trust them enough to actually use them. And a lot of the banks actually mailed out credit cards to people all across the US and just said, here's some free credit cards. And banks lost a lot of money on these things, but it did introduce the technology to the end consumer, which was backed by this traditional rail that had the trust and the ecosystem that I think maybe some of the airdrops of crypto try to emulate, but it doesn't seem to have that backing where it goes instantly into, you can use this thing, you can build off of this thing, you can have a better life and buy dog food and baby diapers and support your family with this new form of money. Instead it kind of turns into this, well, I just participated in a Sybil attack airdrop and got my little farm bag and I'm happy to take it to the bank for more ETH, you know?
So just as another analogy on getting the order in reverse, right? Even when you issue equity, right, as a company and you IPO, now we're sort of starting, a lot of airdrops are IPO first, utility later, right?
Yeah.
And so that contributes to the speculation and wealth transfer and you know, that's not really money.
Yeah, and you know, this is also true. You think about the ones that have succeeded, like Pix and UPI. What came first in India stack? Aadhaar, identity. Before there was any talk of money floating around, there was like, I'm not saying Aadhaar is the best thing ever, but like that was a way that you could actually say, here's the person that I'm giving it to. And we can use that for whatever we use that for. And then we're going to bring money into the picture. And then we're going to bring e-commerce into the picture. Rather than being like, here's like a completely different world that we're going to set up in the nerdiest way conceivable. And then let's like backwards induct, like how do we actually get people to like then adopt this thing that we've built, you know?
It's a cart before the horse sort of situation. Yeah. So maybe some questions that we could dive into specifically for Kenny. How are you guys dealing with like building that type of utility? Are you guys able to like within Manta? Are you guys looking at these opportunities to provide more utility for crypto? Is money a use case for what you guys are building?
I mean, I think at the heart of it, money is the use case in crypto right now, right? Like, no matter how much you try to put lipstick on the pig, right? At the end of the day, it's a very clear sort of incentive in that sense. But that being said, right, like I think you're going to get different answers based on the types of builders that you talk to, right? On our side, because we're more focused on the infrastructure, right? Like we're building for scalability, right? What does scalability mean in this sense? It doesn't necessarily have to be exclusive to payments. It doesn't have to be exclusive to transfers, right? It just has to be more so broader interactions in any sort of Web3 settings. So from that sense, right, like there's a lot of innovation that's happening specifically building on things such as bringing in sort of alternative data availability solutions. But that being said, right, that's getting a little bit more detailed. I think from an infrastructure perspective, right, like our responsibility here is to make sure that there's a scalable system in place. But I think from the application layer, that's where you have to really focus on the idea that Glenn kind of said in like that backwards manner of like, how do you bring this to the actual end user? And I definitely don't think we're at that point right now.
Puja, would you be able to comment maybe more on like the pieces that are missing still to provide that utility? Because I tend to agree with Glenn, this idea of identity being this core piece that's still missing. And I think you're probably well versed enough to maybe provide like what are the missing pieces in this crypto equation to support making it compete with some of the exciting things that are happening in the traditional financial institutions that we're just falling short as a community of crypto advocates, let's say.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to maybe take a step back and clarify what we mean by money, right? So there's sort of a descriptive version of money, which is it's a medium of exchange, and there's a spectrum of money there, right, based off of liquidity. So when you transfer an asset use an asset as a medium of exchange, how quickly does it lose value or how much value is lost, right? And so, gold, or an equivalent like Bitcoin is one extreme, right? And then you also have fiat currencies, but even stocks and bonds, treasury bonds, or different kinds of debt, and even homes are actually forms of money, right? So there's a whole spectrum of assets, right? And then there's this kind of like functional view of like, well, what is money for, right? And so the common thing is that it's a store of it's a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and it's a store of value, right? And I would actually say that like that's sort of where we start to make the mistake, because money, and if you take that sort of very narrow definition, you end up with something like Bitcoin or like gold, right? But actually, before even like currencies, like there was credit, and we don't just want to pay for goods and services, we actually want to pay back debts and issue credit, right? And so critical to credit formation is actually these relationships of trust and credibility, right, and reputation. And so, Glenn and I wrote this paper, Decentralized Society, where we started to think about, well, how can we actually represent these trust relationships and reputation, right? And that was the idea of soul bond tokens, which are really just representing your membership to a group, right? And then through these memberships, being able to like sort of have somebody, stake on your behalf, or groups issue credits to other groups, right? But that's like, we haven't really seen that take off yet in crypto in any meaningful way. And instead we're sort of getting, instead of an emphasis on like social relationships and the trust relationships, we're like, okay, well, maybe we should just sort of just scan our eyeballs and have some identity centralized, managed by WorldCoin, right? And then like start from there. But that's actually kind of making an atomistic mistake, I would say.
So you're not signing up to scan your eyeball?
I have not scanned my eyeball, no. Good. Glenn, maybe you want to comment?
Well, I guess the way I think about it is, I think a fundamental problem with talking about money is that it does bundle together this idea of means of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. And those are actually, like, if you're a technologist and you're saying, look, I'm going to try to solve a problem, you don't say, you know, the radio is like a gathering place for the family, and it's like a way of hearing news, and it's whatever, and then just say, I'm going to create the next thing that's going to do precisely that same set of things. Like, otherwise you're like completely cutting off the ability to explore. Like the iPhone, completely repackaged, like where I listen to my music, where I receive a phone call, and where I, like, the whole point of it was that it was rethinking those things, and like made something of a lot greater utility by repackaging those. And I think you have to think about doing the same when you think about the future of money. Because to think about means of exchange, well, the core of that is kind of like credit and keeping track of reputation and who owes what person what. And that's like one functionality that actually can be performed much better with digital technology than it could with like cash or gold, because it's a much more complicated thing. On the other hand, when you think about a store of value, the whole point of like fiat currency was to get people away from taking an actually useful, valuable thing like gold and like hoarding it. So like the problem there is really a question of like, how do we reduce hoarding? Not a question of like, how do we give someone something else to hoard? Unless that's like the best way to reduce hoarding. And like when you talk about unit of account, the key issue there is really like, how do we talk about things in a stable way that doesn't shift too much? It's really a problem of communication. And like something that is scarce and in fixed supply is like the worst conceivable way to adjust that problem, right? Because everything has to fluctuate with the way that things are going on socially. So we really need to think about like ways of tracking what's going on socially, and how do we make language calibrated to that. So anyway, these are like three quite different problems that happen to have been packaged together. And if we want to solve, we want to try to like separate those out and find good solutions to each of those, rather than like replicating the problems with packaging those things all together.
And just to emphasize like how unsolved this problem is. So like when you think about credit markets, Bitcoin is a deflationary asset. I think most people here think about it, right, as a deflationary asset. But you can't actually build credit markets off deflationary assets, because when there's deflation, the money you have, right, today is worth less than the money will be tomorrow. And so actually, and the same is true with your debt. You owe more tomorrow than you do today, right? So you can't pay back debt. So you can't actually build credit markets off of something as simple as like Bitcoin, right? Or something that just is like number go up, right? So
I mean, my background being more on the product side, you know, we've got our wallet with our users, and you know, we're looking at things like Aave and different lending, borrowing platforms, which I would say solve part of this, but it tends to be more on the over collateralization of these loans, where you deposit, say, $100,000 worth of ETH, and you can maximum borrow maybe $49,000 worth of USDC before you are into this like maximum risk liquidation zone where they just sell your underlying asset and wish you good luck next time. So I guess I'd be curious, since we have so many probably product builders and teams here, how would you guys be approaching these problems to solve the under collateralization of loans using identity?
Speak to that. Do you have any thoughts, Kenny?
Definitely not as much as you guys have on this one.
I mean, I think reputational staking is critical, and that requires that you have something. I mean, look, you do want to talk about really great financial innovations in the last 40 years. One of my favorite is what Muhammad Yunus did. He just became president or prime minister of Bangladesh, and that was all about, you have a relationship with a community. Those people have some reputation. They stake that reputation through personal relationships with a lender. And that allows people to get under collateralized loans, right? So that was incredible. That was all about social relationships. That was all about forming communities, and then those communities having some way to be accountable to somebody for what happens with that loan. Totally different approach than what goes on in this market, where it's about breaking down communities. It's about you having no idea who the person is. but I would claim actually much more decentralized. Because if you have all the different communities around Bangladesh and all these different micro lenders lending to them, that gives power to all these different communities, right? Precisely because it's not anonymous, it's actually more decentralized than something that relies on some abstraction that everyone's supposed to come to in this anonymous way.
Yeah, another way to think about it is to actually look at what happens in traditional banking, right? In fractional reserve banking and deposit creation. And when you get a loan, the functions that the banks do, right, in authenticating your identity, knowing where you live, and essentially engaging a set of social contracts. So if you break your commitment in not paying back the loan, they can seize collateral and they can harness a set of social relationships and institutions, right, to take collateral back. And this enables deposit formation, and it's like the money multiplier effect and so on. And this is how you get massive wealth creation. So looking at actually what traditional banks do and then saying, okay, well, how can you push those functions down to the level of communities and enable them and actually harness the even richer high bandwidth communication happening between people and harness those trust relationships to have the same kind of deposit creation amongst people, right? And that is decentralization, and that's actually expanding credit markets, right? We don't want to have less credit, right? We actually want to expand it and have more credibility around it, so we can build more and do more, right?
Yeah, I actually think it's a great point because there's a lot of rhetoric about decentralization in this space, but I would really challenge people to think about the traditional banking system. I think by almost any sort of objective outside measure of decentralization that you could get, very old-fashioned, actually more old-fashioned than our current banking system banking. You think Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life, that type of banking system. That is way more decentralized than anything going on in the blockchain world. Because it's all about the personal relationships that exist in the local community with the people that you're lending to. And the way that he knows that guy and he knows his family. And that's what Eunice was innovating on, was trying to build in more of that. Let's get outside of these abstract communities that a lot of the banking in the developing world does, where they only are lending to people with some international business or whatever. And let's actually get into those communities to decentralize it more. That's where we made real progress in decentralization. Bitcoin's the opposite of that in many ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's this idea still amongst a lot of the crypto advocates that hard money is needed in order to solve all of the financial woes of the world, and moving away from usury and credit and all of these things provide a net benefit. But I think maybe you guys could speak more to how the world operates in a traditional market and how maybe that point of view for the Bitcoiners in the audience might need to be challenged a little.
Yeah, I mean, going back to comparing, even just the central bank. I'm not saying the central bank is something that's, has its own, set of challenges and trade-offs. But, so many people in, Ethereum community, Bitcoin community, or any token are obsessed with, okay, well, what is the token supply? What is the inflation? Is it fixed? Is it not? And then you kind of look at say, for example, the U.S. central bank, since I'm most familiar with how that works, how that institution works. They actually are not trying to control the quantity of money. They can't. They actually can't, right? All they can do is control the monetary base, which is a set of reserves, right, and currency, and expand and contract, right, their balance sheet, and indirectly try to influence the cost of credit, right? So even central banks are really focused on the cost of credit and right, they're not obsessed with controlling the quantity of money, right? And that has its flaws, and there's forms of systematic risk, and when we're thinking about even decentralizing, banking through cryptocurrencies, we have to think about one of the reasons why we want to do that is to solve some of those systematic risks and idiosyncratic risks, and harness the richness of information in local communities, right? That is a flaw of central banking. But fundamentally, they are focused on that issue, right? Of what is the cost of credit, and so rethinking, and then looking at financial history before, right, when there was say a gold standard, right? And then looking at like the wealth creation that happened when that was sort of like shelved, right? And we started thinking about flexible monetary policy. Like, I think it's useful for people to study financial history, and you know, and just the importance of credit and like the institutions that were built, and then how can we actually make those institutions better by harnessing richer information and communication amongst people.
Well, and you know, you talked about, I think what the fractional reserve example is great, and you talked about the idea of hard money. Hard money is an incredibly centralized concept.
Yeah.
It's like the most centralized way you could possibly conceive of the financial system. Because the whole concept of fractional reserve banking, and again, there's problems with it, there's pluses and minuses, but it's to delegate to a broader set of agents in the economy the creation of the monetary base. It's a decentralization of that process. When you talk about hard money, you're talking about maximally centralized. You're saying like, whatever this protocol is, whatever it is who's determining that monetary base, controls the entire monetary system of the economy. So if you want decentralization, you should actually be asking yourself the question, how do we get out of the hands of just the formal banks and down to the level of a community, like in community lending, that process of credit formation? You should be pushing it outwards rather than saying, no, let's get to hard money, which brings it all into that central protocol, you know?
So it seems like there's like two dominant forces, at least that I observe online and within these crypto conferences and things like that. There's like a subset of the community that believes in emulating the current monetary policies of, I don't know, different countries, or it's just copy paste. What can we replicate in the traditional financial system using crypto and some of the tech here? And then there's this other subset of return to tradition, hard gold-backed dollars. We need to, you know, control the supply, and I guess, are you seeing communities exploring outside of these two subsets? Is there a different way than just copy paste the status quo or return to tradition with gold-backed dollars or something like that? Is there alternative points of view that are not really being discussed at this moment?
I think there's a frontier right now of community currencies, which is kind of harnesses the strengths and discards some of the weaknesses, right, of both digital currencies and of central banking. So in some ways you can think about it as pushing these sort of like central banking functions down to the level of communities. That's one way to look at it, and like in that way, you know, localizing risk more. But depending on like how you can, you know, there are different ways to structure these community currencies. But say once you have some account that has some reputation mixed with community currencies, that's already unlocking much more even the Mohammed Yunus case, right? Because you're allowing not just, you know, lending amongst people, but also richer expressions of like social value on the goods that, say, communities create together, right? And letting like, you know, letting there be some even kind of equilibrium price of what is the value of this community currency relative to the communities within which it's nested, and being able to influence currencies that maybe operate like a fiat currency, right, but have some influence on that, right?
Yeah, and I would also point people towards stuff that they don't even think of as being in the monetary system. For example, you think on likes and followership and the networks of that in social networks. I would say that that's actually much more interesting innovation on what's happening with the financial system in many ways than are the things that are happening within the crypto world. Because the thing is that people are able to harness those networks of respect and affiliation to sell all kinds of things, to ask for favors from people. So that's actually expanding outward the set of ways in which we quantify social trust. Another example like that, Google Scholar, right? This is giving new ways of people quantifying the relationships of esteem and respect within the academic world. not saying it's the perfect thing, whatever, but it's really making progress on that question in an interesting way. Another example, you think of PageRank, the way that websites get surfaced. Huge monetary value to that. I mean, that's the basis, as the US Justice Department just pointed out, of the whole system, a huge part of the economy, and so much of how we allocate purchases of goods, et cetera. Now, those things have lots of problems with them. I'm not saying that they're great, but they're actually really making substantive progress on those questions.
Do you think, Kenny, do you think some of these ideas can be implemented into some of the development that we're seeing in different products related to decentralized autonomous organizations and in improving the formation of communities around improving the quality of their money or their crypto or their token or their blockchain?
Sure. So I think, definitely lots of interesting points. I've been listening this whole time, and there are definitely some limitations that can't necessarily be overcome, right? Like Puja's example of, deflationary and Bitcoin, right? That's not really something that we can change overnight here. But I also think that there are a lot of innovations that truly could happen. And I can give some examples here, but the point here is the incentives are not there, right? I do think that there are, so for example, right, something as unsexy as an index fund, right? When you hear index fund, you think you put money there, you forget about it, you go somewhere else. But there's this magical underlying, whole industry behind you putting your money into something and, forgetting about it. And there's the Goldmans and the JP Morgans of the world arbitraging between the prices of the index fund and everything else, right? And so there's massive money-making opportunity in that sense that can be redistributed, right, to actual end users rather than just being, in this case, kind of a pot of gold for the select larger institutions. And I think these types of ideas that can actually create more sort of wealth distribution is entirely possible when it comes to decentralized products. But I think the current chapter, the current phase that we're in this space, the incentives, right? And this is kind of going back to talking about something as silly as the airdrops, right? And I think the credit card example and the airdrop example is a very good point here, because when people receive these credit card airdrops in the mail, they didn't get it and say, oh, wow, I worked this hard and I finally got the credit card, I'm gonna go do something else now. Like they do with airdrops, right? That's a very huge distinguishment, because receiving the credit card is that first step in this wider sort of distribution of value. And we see this recurring pattern in the crypto space right now in Web3, which is, we want to build these amazing things. We want to, do whatever it is with the intersection of AI and blockchain, whatever that may be, but we fall short of actually achieving those goals because of the incentives that are misaligned with the actual project's, vision, value. And so I don't think it's that it's not possible to recreate and even innovate on some of these sort of financial instruments from traditional markets, but more so the incentive alignment kind of pushes people towards more, short-term goals in some sense.
I really like that example of index funds, and I wanted to pick up on it for a second, because look, what would a really interesting stablecoin market be like? That's not recreating the thing or creating harder money, but going in the opposite direction. Let me just give a little illustration. Stable coins are not stable. Because the US dollar is not stable. I mean, it's not a stable value. US dollar's been having all kinds of inflation problems, whatever. If you want to do better than that, how do you do better than that? You got to match it so that the price index doesn't fluctuate. You got to actually do better than the US dollar on dealing with inflation. How could you do that? Well, you don't just do it by having a better monetary policy, whatever, that would be great. But even better would be, people face different prices in different places. Poor people in the US have a different set of things that they buy than rich people in the US. And people in particular local areas have different things. So what if you had this personalized set of stablecoins that stayed stable against the local prices that different types of people were facing in different places? And you managed to actually keep its value constant for now, that sounds crazy, right? that sounds so ambitious, but is it so ambitious? We have so much data now. The data's out there everywhere, and the neural nets can deal with it. And you could actually try to calibrate things on a day-by-day basis to the types of prices that people were facing. It's not a crazy thing to do. Amazon probably has the information to figure a lot of that out. I mean, but I'm not saying that's all perfect, whatever, but I'm just saying like that's a direction to imagine things that actually might really have utility for people, because then they don't need to worry about inflation anymore.
I personally would love to see Bezos enter the stablecoin space. Yeah. So I guess moving on to more on the product side, because I think I'd love to hear more about the L2 space and some of the different areas that they're trying to solve some of this idea of like throughput issues. Like we see Bitcoin, the transactions per second are extremely limited. And Ethereum itself has been, for years now, building on this idea of layer 2 scaling. Where do you see the layer 2 aspect supporting the use cases of money?
Yeah, I mean, it also kind of depends on, again, to something that Puja brought up about, how do you define money, right? And I think like the broader term, right? If you're simply thinking about it as a store of value, which I do see like, Bitcoin essentially becoming this sort of store of value, then the solution's kind of already there with Bitcoin, right? But when you're talking more about like transfer of value, these are looking more into like transactions, and just imagine how many transactions people do on a daily basis, right? This is something that Bitcoin can't do. I don't know if you guys have ever, moved Bitcoin or not, but sometimes it takes 10 minutes, sometimes it takes 3 hours. And so it's not exactly the best sort of transfer vehicle. And so as a result, right, like we're looking into a lot of sort of scalability solutions in the industry right now. But I think scalability is definitely going to have to face some contention against centralization at some point, right? Like I think when people talk about decentralization on the architectural level, they talk more so about like the independence of each of the contributors to the network to move the network forward, rather than necessarily the disbursement and distribution of like the wealth. And so even from that architectural level, I think the more you disperse, the slower a system's going to be. That's just what you see in any sort of industry. And so I think when it comes to something like a layer 2 solution, and this is going back to sort of Vitalik's trilemma, right? You've got these 3 different sort of variables, of which 2 can be achieved by any particular solution, but not all 3. I don't think that L2 scaling solutions, even L3 scaling solutions, are bound by trying to solve that trilemma problem, but rather the responsibility is to more so focus on the scalability and security angle, whereas the infrastructure level is more so focused on that decentralization side, right? So the L1, the Ethereums of the world, are focused on the decentralization in terms of architecture distribution, and then in terms of scalability, the L2s, the L3s, and I think eventually, right, centralized solutions are going to kind of emerge from that. And we're going to be in a world where majority of people that are interacting on a payments rails basis probably don't even touch Ethereum at all, right? They're just going to be interacting just like how you interact with your point of service, right? Like you swipe your credit card, something happens, but you don't directly talk with Visa, right? Visa doesn't directly interact with you in any way, right? And so I think like when it comes to infrastructure, it's probably going to be the same way, and we're probably going to be seeing a lot of centralized solutions play out, because the reality here is, maybe everyone in the audience here is familiar and understands how to hold Bitcoin or Ethereum or something in a wallet and be responsible for that wallet. And hopefully none of you guys have ever been impacted by fraud or phishing attempts or anything. But when you try to scale that out to a world, right, of billions of people, then you can't necessarily anticipate the same level of proactiveness from each and every individual. And so inevitably, these services that provide this level of convenience are going to have to emerge. And I think those services will end up centralized, and that's perfectly okay. I think it has to be some type of blend there.
I think there has been sort of a LARP related to decentralization, especially I think for a lot of projects, they use the cover of decentralization to, I don't know, withdraw risk from some of the creators or group of creators. And it does seem like in the last year or two, more and more projects have kind of embraced more of some of the centralization and maybe even some of the benefits of centralization. Many projects do benefit from like a benevolent dictator or a CEO or some sort of like person, one person who's taking charge and taking lead to rally the community. I'd be curious to know how you guys see the centralization or the re-centralization from some of these originally decentralized projects emerge to support some of the growth and use cases in order to compete with the traditional payment rails that are largely run by corporations. They're run by, corporate organizational structures, not decentralized, anonymous anime characters on Twitter.
Sure, I'll put in a quick comment and then let everyone else respond. So I think, your point, I think the key phrase here is benevolent dictatorship. And as soon as you said that, I thought Singapore, right? And if you think beyond Singapore and you think about all of these developing nations, and especially developing nations that have just exploded over the past, 50 years, to some degree, right? There is a level of, a small group taking very much a large control, taking charge and just kind of driving in one sort of direction. And I think that's a scary thought in Web3 because everyone likes this idea, right? LARPing about decentralization. But the reality is especially in patterns that you see in innovation, right? There's a strong central catalyst that kind of drives everything else. And I think that that's okay even in the crypto space, right? I don't think that anyone is expecting everything to be, I guess, objectively decentralized, right? Like I say objectively because I don't even think that most people really know what it means to be decentralized. It's just kind of like this term. And even at the SEC level, right? Like Hester Pierce and her proposal about, decentralization is not a one and done. It's a process. And I think the process can start with something much more centralized to drive that innovation. And maybe one day if it gets to the point where the community is satisfied, then you can think about how to distribute that power across the community rather than claiming that it's fully distributed on day one.
I think this question is, what do you want out of these systems, right? So one of the other properties that draws a lot of people to crypto and to this goal of decentralization is censorship resistance, right? And so that is a trade-off, right, with centralization. I would also say, kind of like to the point that Glen was making, when the goal here is to actually do better, right, than the traditional financial system. And so to introduce, less volatility and wring out risk, right? And risk is an information problem, right? It's unintegrated information markets. And so decentralization is actually what it's doing is we like it because it is solving an information problem. It means that there's more integrated information. And so you have less volatility, right? And this reduces uncertainty. This enables more wealth creation. And ultimately, with wealth creation, we like that because we live longer, happier, healthier, more educated lives, right? That's kind of really what we care about is human flourishing. So, centralized systems, yeah, okay, you can make an L2, it's centralized, that's a trend, whatever, but is it actually doing something different than the traditional financial system? If it's not, then is it really worth the time, right, and the energy? Or, especially since a lot of L2s have volatility, right? We're talking about making this useful for people. So I think decentralization is actually, there's not one mathematical characterization of it. Glen, you have a lot of beautiful analogies and that relate to plurality. But it's something that actually has very concrete benefits for people and wealth creation and economic productivity. Maybe you can offer some analogies, Glen, that you've had for thinking about decentralization, objects and within a space and.
Yeah, look, where does the term decentralization as it's used now come from? It comes from packet switching and the architecture of networks and the idea that the US was afraid of nuclear attack by Russians, and they wanted the network to survive that. So that was a pretty concrete reason why you would worry about that property of the system. And it turned out to have a lot of efficiency benefits as well, because there was a lot of unreliable equipment and it would go down. And the AT&T network that was switching everything just turned out that it would perform a lot better if you had a lot of distributed switching elements. And that's what led to the miracle of the internet. So, like, where in the current obsession with decentralization is that focus on concrete benefits and utility? Versus where is decentralization being used as an ideological lever in a speculative frenzy to get people to put money into a thing that then has literally no foundation in the actual product being offered, as we were just saying. Like, decentralization seems to be often like a very, very distant promise that is being made to raise capital for speculation against things, rather than a design feature of a system so that you can achieve a concrete goal.
Do you think that the public perception of crypto is being influenced at this point, where these problems that crypto originally, or Bitcoin and crypto in general, were originally trying to solve, are now more difficult as a result of just the excess, the silliness, the meme culture, the PvP nature of wealth transfer from one chain to another? Are these problems hurting the potential goals here?
I think you can even just look at the potential goals of stated within a community or currency, like even like Bitcoin, right? Or even Ethereum. Because these are systems that aren't incorporating social relationships and trust, right, and identity, they're essentially like proof of stake, proof of work, right? They have the tendencies towards oligopolistic market structure. And that oligopolistic market structure undermines, right, these censorship resistance properties. And the censorship resistance properties is what makes these currencies kind of more universalizable to some extent, that enables somebody who's trying to escape, say, an autocratic regime to use it and go somewhere else and, right, not be censored. So it's like, you know, the identity, reputation, encoding relationships of trust and confidence, enabling groups to represent themselves, stake, confidence, and you as an individual being able to like define yourself as a kind of constellation of communities to whom you have commitments, and individuals to whom you have commitments, right? If you don't do that, then you actually even undermine the stated purported white paper goals, right? And so, yeah, I think decentralization is front and center here. And I don't think it's like the short-term trade-offs that people are sort of willing to take. That's fine, but you're also it's going to be a short-term, again, wealth transfer, and not lead to the kind of,
Well,
moving out the productivity frontier.
I also think that, the problem that you just stated, Corbin, is on the verge of, with some probability, becoming like infinitely more extreme in the next, let's say, 3 months. And the reason is that I think there's a reasonable probability that people will, let's say in 3 to 6 months, come to have their primary impression of the point of the whole crypto ecosystem being the transfer of wealth to a set of people who use that wealth to fund potentially violent political action that could support the maintenance of that wealth, et cetera, just given the current dynamics of what's going on in the United States. And if that comes to be the understanding of this space, we speculated that transferred wealth to a set of people who then supported violent political action to defend that wealth that was created through that cycle, like, that's going to really color everything that people think from then on, because that's just a much more dramatic event than anything positive that has occurred within the ecosystem. You know what I mean?
I also just think people, we are at this point in history, a very profound point with generative AI, right? And we need to find ways to continue to let people be market participants and earn a living, right? And there's a really profound way in which, the kind of identity substrate we're talking about will enable participation into the AI economy and not just, relegation to, automated luxury communism delivered through your WorldCoin wallet. You know what I mean? And like, so there's a lot at stake here, right? The future, people are nervous. There's rising inequality, but at the same time, there's like just massive opportunities to like generate wealth and advance technology and like unlock these like wild futures, right? That are really cool with technology. But if we just if this kind of distributed ledger gets relegated as like a scammy technology, then we are stuck with very centralized solutions that don't help people become market participants, but instead become sort of like data slaves.
And I just want to I don't want to be so like pessimistic, which is to say that like, look, I think that this space has accomplished a tremendous amount. I do not believe, frankly, that Apple Pay, that UPI, that Pix, that any of these things would exist if the pressure to solve the issues about payments in the digital space that the crypto ecosystem put onto the traditional system had not existed. Like, I don't think any of that would have happened, because these things knocked on the door and they made some noise and the system responded. And now there's a like real opportunity to think, what is the next thing we want to put pressure on the system to do? Or to think, we really like what's been accomplished. Let's go into that ecosystem and build more functionality on top of it. Those are really productive things that could go on. Is it really productive to like scream even louder, like pile into our thing, put more money in, and give it to the people who are holding massive amounts of that stuff so they can then go and undermine the institutions of democratic governance? Like, maybe that's not the best like use of our attention when we have those other two options,
Yeah, and I think like, just kind of going back to the core of the question, right? Like, you think the question here, or the point here is, or the consideration, I guess, is, are we really at this pivotal moment where this meme culture, airdrops, and this frenzy defines the industry? Or is this truly another sort of chapter of growth, right? And I mean, Glenn, your example of, like using cryptocurrency to fund bad things, right? Like, it's definitely happened in the past, right? Like, there's no doubt. And I think like that definitely used to define Bitcoin as well, right? I mean, we live, ironically, such a short term, we've redefined, what Bitcoin is in the perception of an everyday person, right? You asked them 10 years ago, right? And it's like, oh, I'm never going to touch that. It's only for gamblers. It's only for money launderers. It's only for all this bad stuff, right? Like, you ask them now, it's still kind of got that sentiment, right? But I don't think that sentiment currently outweighs other sort of sentiments that you hear from an average person that seems to be slightly more educated on Bitcoin than before. And I bring this up because there is this continued sort of sentiment shift that I also agree, for Glenn's point about like where is this going next? And so I just want to bring some examples of like the other industries, right? And so I started my career in cloud computing, and when I started in cloud computing, the only sort of major contender there was Amazon AWS, right? Must be a household name for any builder in this room. And at the time as well, right? Like there was no use case for cloud other than shadow IT, which is just developers kind of in the basements of their IT departments testing sandbox environments before they kind of throw things into actual production. And when you threw things into production, right, like you put them on real servers, like the actual things that enterprises could use. And so I would go to these conferences and I would listen to people talk about cloud computing, and it was kind of similar in the sense of like, oh, you know, there's no actual use case for cloud. We already have all this infrastructure in our basement, right? So when you actually want to do something with us, right, and you actually want to be serious about deploying an application, just use what we already have, right? You fast forward to 2024, now there is no business that exists, at least, you know, globally, that doesn't rely on cloud computing in some extraordinary way. And then another sort of silly example is even social media, right? Like I don't know. I've never spoken to the founder of Twitter, but I'm assuming that when Twitter first started, no one anticipated that it would be this global make it or break it platform that could dissolve relationships geopolitically overnight. You know, when I remember when it first came out, it was just news articles about, oh, who the heck is going to listen to or care about someone who talks about what they ate for breakfast every single day? It's so stupid. It's so silly. There's no actual use case. Only like, you know, teenagers are going to have fun with it. And now all of a sudden it's morphed into this thing that I just described earlier, right? Like, I mean, you know, Trump tweets can make or break a stock price. And so, you know, I think like the crypto space, Web3 has that same opportunity. In this current chapter, I think there are a lot of things that are being done that shouldn't necessarily be taken seriously, right? And because like these are not the things that can drive the industry forward. And so, you know, a lot of the topics that we already covered, including like these misaligned incentives, I think is kind of a growing pain, right? Like this rebellious teenager stage that doesn't have to define the industry itself, but you know, we do have to ask the question, right? Like, where does the industry want to go? Yeah.
Great, thank you, everyone. That was great.
Well, I think that sums up pretty well everything. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Ultimately, we're all excited for the future of money. There are problems to solve, and we're excited to see where all of you hopefully help bring those solutions to reality. So thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you for the panelists on the future of money.